What if the frost beneath your feet wasn't just winter's chill, but the lingering grief of a goddess who lost her only daughter? Long before people talked about seasons, Persephone's abduction froze the world and brought the first winter. Her journey between worlds became the reason flowers bloom, then wither, and why the earth sometimes falls silent. But before the silence and the cold, there was a time when the meadows of Sicily seemed endless, when sunlight spilled across wildflowers and nothing hinted at loss. So, let's step back to that golden moment, just before the world changed. Here in the meadow, time didn't seem to matter. Everything stretched out in waves of green and gold, the grass soft underfoot and the air warm with the promise of another perfect day. The sun poured down, bright but gentle, and the scent of growing things drifted everywhere. Sweet, clean, and light enough that you almost didn't notice it. If you closed your eyes, you'd hear laughter, soft and easy, blending with the wind. That was Persephone. She didn't fill the field with noise or command attention. She simply belonged, her presence as natural as the wildflower she touched. She moved among the blooms with her woven basket, fingers trailing over petals as if greeting old friends. It was a place she'd known since she was a child. Her steps once clumsy, now confident, skipping over stones worn smooth by centuries. Her laughter had always been there, bubbling up like a hidden spring, never forced, never heavy. You got the sense she believed this place would always be waiting for her, that the flowers would always bloom just in time for her return. Persephone wasn't alone. The Oceanids, daughters of the river god Oceanus, joined her, their voices rising and falling in bright bursts as they gathered lilies and violets, weaving crowns and bracelets from whatever they picked. They moved as a group, their hair braided, arms full of color, never straying far from Persephone. You could almost forget they were goddesses, the way they played. But their laughter held a kind of weightlessness that set them apart from anything mortal. From where I watched, part of the rocks, the soil, the very wildflowers themselves, I saw it all unfold. My existence is tied to this patch of Sicilian earth. I don't mark time the way the gods or mortals do, I just exist, the way the stones and roots do, seeing everything and changing nothing. Persephone had grown up here, her joy growing with her, her presence bright enough to make even the oldest trees seem young. Demeter's daughter, always at the center of things, always untouched by anything darker than a passing cloud. But even in a place like this, there are layers. Under the gold and purple, beneath the roots, something waited. The earth keeps secrets better than any god. It remembers every scheme, every whispered plan, every promise broken. Maybe I was imagining it, but the ground felt heavier than usual, as if holding its breath. It wasn't the restful kind of quiet you get after a long day. It was the kind that presses on your chest, making you notice the silence. Still, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was just the land, a witness to everything, powerless to change it. Watching Persephone in that moment, barefoot, her robe brushing the damp grass, sunlight tangled in her hair, you'd think nothing could touch her. There was a kind of peace in her, a brightness that felt unbreakable. You start to believe that kind of happiness could last forever. But nothing lasts forever, not even in a place like this. It was the narcissus that changed everything, not just any flower, but one brighter than the rest, standing out even in a field full of beauty. Its petals seemed to catch the light in a way that drew your eyes. Almost too perfect, almost unnatural. According to the old hymns, it was Rhea who planted it there, meant to catch Persephone's attention, to draw her in. The narcissus was a lure crafted by gods, a bit of beauty with an edge. It blended in with the lilies and roses, but if you looked closely, you'd see it didn't quite belong. The ancient Greeks knew that nature could be both beautiful and dangerous, and nothing in this meadow proved that more than this single radiant flower. Persephone noticed it, of course. She always did. Her curiosity was as much a part of her as her laughter. She leaned in, humming to herself, her nymph friends drifting around her, their baskets overflowing. The sun caught in her hair, the breeze moved the hyacinths, and for a moment it was just another day. But I felt it, the ground tightening, a pressure building beneath the roots. The earth doesn't hold its breath for mortals, but for gods it pauses, unsure if it should continue as usual or brace for what's coming. You know that feeling, right? When everything seems perfect, but there's a strange tension you can't explain? Most people brush it off, blame it on a passing chill or a cloud covering the sun. But for me, tied to the land, it was impossible to ignore. The roots trembled, the flowers seemed to falter, and the air felt heavy. The land was afraid. It hadn't always been like this. When Persephone first wandered these meadows, there was nothing to fear. Demeter, her mother, had made this place safe. Every flower, every blade of grass, cultivated to protect her child. Even the seasons seemed to hold back, letting the warmth last a little longer. The blooms stay open a little later. Back then, the games never ended. Persephone and her friends chased butterflies, hid behind old trees, and rested in the shade, safe from anything that might threaten their peace. But on this day, things felt different. The laughter sounded a little thinner, the air a little too sweet, and Persephone's eyes kept drifting back to that narcissus. Her nymph companions, oceanids if you care about the details, trailed after her, their voices fading into the background as she knelt by the strange flower. They didn't notice me, or maybe they never really saw me at all. Persephone's curiosity was sharper now, her focus narrowed to the narcissus, her form bent, hair spilling forward, hand outstretched. The ground's tension grew. Not loud, not obvious, but there if you were paying attention. The meadow, for all its beauty, was never meant for sudden changes. Serenity doesn't prepare you for violence. It just exists, expecting the peace to last. But as Persephone's fingers reached for the narcissus, I felt something deep in my roots. A tremor, a warning I couldn't share. Even things that seem eternal, a perfect day, a goddess's laughter, can vanish in a blink. We hold onto these moments hoping they'll last, trusting the ground beneath us to stay steady. But sometimes all it takes is a single moment, a hand reaching a little too far, a breath held a little too long. The illusion of safety is just that, an illusion. So there she was, Persephone, poised on the edge of something she couldn't see, drawn by a beauty she couldn't resist. The meadow was quiet, the air thick with expectation, every detail sharp and clear, the color of the grass, the hum of insects, the faint perfume of flowers. The oceanids watched, baskets forgotten as Persephone leaned in, her hand hovering above the narcissus, caught in that last instant before everything changed. The ground beneath us seemed to tense, as if the earth itself was waiting, unsure of what would happen next. And in that pause, in that silence, you could almost believe nothing would ever disturb this peace. But the world has a way of reminding you that even the most perfect moments are fragile. and sometimes the smallest action, a hand reaching for a flower, can set everything in motion. Persephone leaned in, her hand hovering just above the narcissus. The meadow was still, the air thick with anticipation, and the warmth of the sun felt almost fragile. Her laughter, so easy a moment before, faded into the hush. She didn't notice how the ground pressed up against her feet, or how the breeze seemed to vanish, leaving a hush that felt unnatural. Her fingers brushed the flower's pale petals, and then, without warning, everything changed. The earth tore open beneath her. It was sudden, a single shattering rupture that ripped through the meadow. The sound was deep and final, not a slow groan or a warning rumble, but a violent split that felt like the world's own heartbeat, skipping. The crack shot outward from where Persephone knelt, cutting through grass and soil with a sharpness that left no room for doubt. For a moment, it seemed as if the ground itself had turned against her, breaking apart in one swift, unstoppable motion. The narcissus snapped, its bright beauty lost in the shadow that surged up from the chasm. Persephone's scream followed, piercing the silence, her voice echoing over the meadow. Her companions, the oceanids, stood frozen, baskets slipping from their fingers, petals tumbling to the ground. Then panic set in, and they scattered, their cries lost in the roar of the earth's wound. From the darkness, Hades appeared. He rose from the fissure in a golden chariot, just as the old stories tell it. The chariot gleamed, bright even in the shadow, its wheels spinning over the jagged earth. The horses that drew it were black as obsidian, their eyes burning with a light that didn't belong to this world. Hades himself was unmistakable, tall, severe and silent, a figure carved from the night. He wasn't monstrous, but his presence filled the space, swallowing the last traces of sunlight from the meadow. He moved with purpose, his expression unreadable, his actions certain. There was no hesitation as he reached for Persephone, no words to soften what was happening. He took her wrist in his hand, his grip unyielding. This wasn't a moment for pleading or protest. It was an act already decided, the kind of thing that felt older than the gods themselves. Persephone fought back. She twisted in his grasp, her free hand clawing at his arm, her sandals scraping against the broken edge of the earth. Her hair slipped from its braid, catching the last of the sun as she struggled. Her wreath fell, landing in the dirt between the wildflowers and the spreading shadow. Hades didn't pause, his arm locked around her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Her screams tore through the air, sharp and wild, echoing where laughter had lived only moments before. And I, rooted in this place, part of the stone and soil, could do nothing. My existence was to watch, to witness the beauty and the breaking of the land. Now all I could feel was the shock of betrayal. The earth itself split open in a way that felt personal. I had always been the silent observer, but this was different. The ground that had held Persephone safe had turned on her, and I could only watch as she was taken. The chariot began its descent, sinking into the earth as the gap widened. The air around them grew cold, the sunlight dimming as if the world was pulling away. Persephone's nails dug into the chariot's edge, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked up, searching for something. Her friends, her mother, anyone to help. But there was nothing. Her world had been meadows and warmth, not gods who came from below, not darkness that swallowed the day. Hades drove the chariot forward, silent and unstoppable. The horses surged, their hooves striking sparks from the stone, the wheels grinding against the torn ground. The scent of crushed flowers mixed with the damp earth, a heavy reminder of what was being lost. There were no words between them, no explanations or apologies. Just the sound of the chariot, the struggle and the closing of the world above. Her cries faded as the chariot disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the earth. The crack began to close, not in a rush, but slowly, as if the land itself was reluctant to hide what had happened. The grass bent, the wildflowers toppled, and the last trace of the Underworld's passage was buried beneath the surface. Silence returned, but it wasn't the gentle quiet of a summer afternoon. It was heavy, pressing down on everything, filling the space where Persephone's laughter had been. The Oceanids were gone, their flight marked only by scattered petals and broken stems. The meadow felt empty, every trace of warmth and color dulled by what had happened. Hades, ruler of the Underworld, had come and gone in a moment. He was a god who rarely left his realm, content with shadows and silence. But today he had crossed the boundary, claiming Persephone in a single, decisive act. His chariot, described in the old hymns as golden, had split the earth and left the world above, changed in ways no one could yet understand. There was no warning, no thunder from Zeus, no sign from the sky. The gods above had watched unmoving as the world below shifted. Some say there were reasons, arrangements made in silence, but on this day, all anyone could feel was the absence left behind. The earth settled, but nothing felt healed. Persephone was gone, her presence pulled from the roots and stones, leaving behind a hollowness that nothing could fill. Even the wildflowers seemed to sense it, their petals curling inward, their colors fading. The meadow was quiet, but beneath that quiet, something new was growing. Not hope, but a shadow, a sense that the world had shifted and would not return to how it was. Her voice lingered, not in sound, but in the memory of the land itself. The roots ached for her. The soil remembered her steps. And as the day wore on, a chill settled over the meadow, the kind that sinks into the ground and waits. The world had lost something bright, and the silence that followed was not the end, but the beginning of something colder. The meadow stood empty, the sky turning pale as the sun dipped lower. Nothing moved, not even the wind. It was as if the world was waiting, unsure what to do now that Persephone was gone. Somewhere, far from this place, the gods would begin to stir, and a mother would start to search for her missing child. But here, in the quiet aftermath, the earth simply held its breath, uncertain and changed. Demeter arrived at the empty meadow, and, for the first time, the world felt wrong to her. There was no warning, no omen, just the cold absence where her daughter's laughter should have been. The goddess who made the fields bloom and the orchards heavy with fruit found herself standing in a place that felt hollow, stripped of all meaning. She wasn't built for this kind of loss. The gods were supposed to be eternal, untouched by the pain that gnaws at mortals. But grief doesn't care about titles or immortality. She started to search. Not a careful, measured search, but a frantic, unstoppable wandering that ignored the passing of days and nights. For 9 days, Demeter moved across the earth, her feet pounding out her desperation. The jewels came out of her hair. The golden robes were replaced with black. She cast off every sign of her divinity, as if stripping herself down might bring her closer to the missing piece of her heart. She carried 2 torches, their flames flickering in the wind, lighting her way through mountains, forests, and the places mortals dared not go. Their glow was harsh, throwing shadows everywhere, but it was nothing compared to the darkness inside her. She refused ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, letting herself grow gaunt and hollow. The Homeric hymn says she would not touch them until she learned the truth. It wasn't just a hunger strike. It was a refusal to accept comfort while Persephone was lost. Even the simple act of bathing was set aside. Demeter let her sorrow mark her body as much as her spirit. She searched by torchlight, night and day blurring together, her grief radiating into the land itself. The meadow where Persephone had vanished began to change. The flowers drooped, their colors dulling, the grass growing brittle underfoot. I could feel it too, deep in the soil. My roots, usually steady, recoiled from a chill that wasn't natural. This wasn't the gentle frost that signals the end of autumn. This was something heavier, a cold that seeped into every stone and seed, a sorrow that pressed down on the whole world. Demeter didn't stop. She moved from field to field, river to river, calling her daughter's name. She questioned every echo, every rumor of laughter, every whisper of movement in the shadows. The rivers didn't answer. The trees stood silent. The wind brought her nothing but memories. Even the birds seemed to fall quiet, as if they knew better than to interrupt a goddess in mourning. On the 3rd day, Demeter met Hecate. Hecate, with her own torch, was a goddess who knew about boundaries and the things that slip between them. She didn't have answers, but she offered a direction. Seek out Helios, the sun, the one called the spy of gods and men. If anyone had seen what happened, it would be him. So Demeter and Hecate joined forces, their torches burning side by side as they set out to confront the only witness who could not look away. All the while, Demeter's grief kept spreading. It wasn't just her own pain anymore, it became the world's pain. The goddess of the harvest neglected her duties. Crops withered in the fields. The wheat shriveled, the olive trees dropped their fruit, the orchards stood barren. Even the wild grasses lost their green, turning brittle and grey. The rivers ran low, and the land seemed to curl in on itself, waiting for warmth that never came. This was not the usual turn of seasons. This was the world's first winter, a stillness born from heartbreak and longing. Humans were the first to notice. The farmers and foragers watched their fields go empty. Animals wandered farther for food, growing thin and desperate. The prayers started then, pleas to Demeter, to the gods, to anyone who might listen. People crowded temples, offering what little they had, begging for the return of abundance. But Demeter, lost in her search, heard none of it. She was still walking the earth, black-robed and hollow-eyed, her torches burning through the night. The famine grew. Hunger gnawed at the edges of every village and city. People grew desperate, their hope fading as the days passed with no sign of relief. The gods on Olympus, usually so distant from mortal suffering, began to take notice. This was no ordinary bad harvest. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. The altars stood empty. The fires in the temples burned out. Even the prayers seemed to float up and vanish unanswered. Zeus, who had always kept himself above the troubles of mortals, finally felt the pressure. Without humans, there would be no offerings, no worship, no one to keep the gods' stories alive. He sent Iris, the rainbow messenger, to plead with Demeter. Iris found her wandering, torch in hand, Looking more like a shadow than a goddess, she delivered Zeus's request. Let the earth bloom again, end the famine, restore the balance. But Demeter refused. No promise or oath could matter to her now. Her only answer was silence, and the continued march of her grief. The other gods tried as well. One by one they came down from Olympus, offering comfort, bargains, even threats. Demeter listened to none of it. She wouldn't let the world heal until her daughter was returned. Her pain was too deep, her love too fierce to be soothed by words. The earth remained barren, the cold deepened, and the famine spread. It was more than just the absence of food. The world itself seemed to pause. Time slowed, the cycles of growth and decay thrown out of order. For someone like me, rooted in the land, it was a strange kind of agony. My rocks felt the press of frost for the first time. The wildflowers Persephone once gathered lay dormant, their roots clinging to soil that could give them nothing. The sun felt distant, its warmth unable to reach beneath the surface. Everything waited, tense and brittle, for something to change. This was winter before mortals had a word for it, a silence that wasn't rest, a cold that wasn't part of the natural cycle. It was the shape of Demeter's grief, pressed into every inch of the earth. Her love was strong enough to stop the world, but her sorrow threatened to break it. The gods, the mortals, even the land itself understood. Nothing would grow, nothing would move forward until Persephone was found. As the days dragged on, the famine became impossible to ignore. The gods on Olympus argued and schemed, trying to find a solution that would save humanity and restore the old order. But Demeter's message was clear. She would not relent. If Persephone remained lost, the world would remain barren. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't a punishment. It was simply the truth of her grief. The loss of Persephone wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the unraveling of everything that held the world together. Mortals would one day call this winter a season that comes and goes. But for those of us tied to the land, it was something else entirely. It was a kind of waiting that felt endless, a longing that seeped into the stones and the roots. The frost wasn't just cold, it was a memory, a name whispered over and over in the dark. Persephone. Persephone. The world hung in that silence, caught between what had been and what might never be again. Demeter kept searching, her torches flickering in the shadows, her footsteps echoing through empty fields. The gods watched from above, uneasy and powerless. The mortals huddled together, hoping for a sign, a change, a thaw. But nothing came. The earth remained still, the cold unbroken, the grief unending. And so the world waited with her. The air grew thin, the ground hard and unyielding. The only thing moving was Demeter herself, relentless in her search, refusing to let go of hope even as everything else fell silent. Her pain became the landscape, shaping every hill and hollow, every barren field and frozen river. The world's first winter was not a season, but a story written in the language of loss. Somewhere on the edge of that silence, a new kind of anticipation began to build. It was the question that pressed on every root and stone. How does a mother learn the truth about her missing child? And what will she do when she finally hears it? Hecate's torchlight flickered against the darkness as she and Demeter stood together. Two goddesses whose paths rarely crossed except at the edges of things. Boundaries, crossroads, the uncertain border between knowing and not knowing. Hecate, always the one to keep her own counsel, didn't offer comfort or easy words. She just pointed Demeter in the right direction, naming the only being who might have seen what happened. Helios, the sun. If you were searching for the truth in a world crowded with secrets, Helios was the one you went to. His golden chariot swept across the sky every day, his eyes missing nothing, gods, mortals, and everything in between. He was called the spy of gods and men for a reason. So, Demeter and Hecate made their way toward the sun, their torches burning low, but their purpose sharpening with each step. The search was no longer directionless. It had a target now, and the air felt different, charged, tense, like the moment before a storm. When Demeter finally reached Helios, she didn't bother with pleasantries. The light radiating from him was almost painful, the rocks and grass around him shimmering as if they'd caught fire. But Demeter wasn't there to be dazzled. She stood out in her black robes, her face set and unyielding, the grief in her eyes burning brighter than any torch. She asked her question straight out, her voice steady but raw. "Where is my child?" It was less a plea, and more a demand for the universe to finally give up its secrets. Helios didn't answer right away. You could see the hesitation, the way his light seemed to pulse and flicker as if he was weighing what to say. He wasn't arrogant, not like some of the other gods. His knowledge set him apart, made him distant but not unfeeling. He understood that some truths were heavy, and this one was heavier than most. The silence stretched out, the air thick with anticipation, until finally Helios spoke. His words came slowly, each one deliberate. "Daughter of Rhea, Demeter, you will learn this. I respect you and feel for you because of your beautiful-footed daughter." There was something almost gentle in his tone, a softness you wouldn't expect from the sun. But then he gave her the truth, plain and unvarnished. Zeus bears responsibility, for he gave her to be Hades' wife. His brother took her violently to the dark realm, heedless of your cries. The words landed with a kind of finality that didn't need thunder or lightning to make their point. Zeus, king of the gods, keeper of order, her own brother, had not only known about Persephone's disappearance, but had allowed it to happen. He had given Persephone to Hades, sealing her fate without a word to her mother. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a miscommunication. It was a decision, and it had been made in silence. You can picture Demeter in that moment. She'd already lost her daughter, but this was a different kind of loss. To find out that someone she trusted, someone who held the balance of the world in his hands, had been complicit, that was a different wound entirely. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cold, the kind that settles deep and doesn't let go. Demeter didn't argue, didn't shout. She just let the truth settle in, her hands tight at her sides, her jaw clenched. Helios went on, as if offering some kind of explanation, or maybe just stating the facts as he saw them. Hades commands respect as ruler of 1/3 of the world. That was the way of things among the gods, power, domains, the balance of realms. The sun wasn't trying to comfort her. He was just telling her how it was. Hades was now her son-in-law, ruler of the Underworld, and that was supposed to mean something. Maybe it did to the gods, but to Demeter, it meant nothing except more distance, more cold. There was no comfort in knowing the rules had been followed, no solace in the idea of respect or cosmic order. Demeter's grief was bigger than that. It was personal, immediate, and it radiated out from her like a second winter. She didn't thank Helios, didn't ask for more. The answer was enough. Enough to set her next steps. Enough to change the world. Hecate waited a moment longer as if expecting Helios to offer something else. A promise, a hint of hope. But he stayed silent. The sun had done his part. The truth was out, and now it was up to Demeter to decide what to do with it. So they left him there, the light of his chariot fading behind them as they walked away. Demeter didn't turn toward Olympus. She didn't go to confront Zeus, didn't demand an explanation or an apology. What could he possibly say that would matter? The damage was done, and words wouldn't bring Persephone back. Instead, Demeter kept moving, her black robes swirling around her, her torch burning low. She left the world of gods behind, walking among mortals who didn't know her pain but would soon feel its effects. If you were there, you'd see how the earth itself seemed to react to her presence. The grass under her feet shriveled, the trees bent away from her shadow, and the air grew colder with every step she took. Her sorrow wasn't just her own anymore. It seeped into the ground, spreading out in waves, touching everything. She was a goddess, but she was also a mother, and her grief was rewriting the rules of the world. Zeus's choice wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a decision that rippled outward, touching gods and mortals alike. The fields stayed empty, the rivers ran low, and the world waited for something to change. Up on Olympus, the gods watched in uneasy silence. They knew what Demeter's anger meant, but they also knew that nothing would move her until Persephone was returned. The old order had been shaken, and now everyone was holding their breath. For me, watching from the rocks and soil, it felt like the whole world had tightened up, waiting for what would come next. Demeter's anger wasn't the kind that burned hot and then faded. It was steady, cold, the kind that lasts. She didn't lash out at the land or the sky. She just kept moving, her purpose sharpening with every step. The world grew quieter, the cold deeper, as if everything was bracing for the next blow. The meadow where Persephone had vanished was almost unrecognizable now. The flowers were gone, the grass brittle, the trees stripped bare. The frost that had started at the edges had spread, covering everything in a thin, crystalline layer. Even the light seemed different, paler, weaker, as if the sun itself was mourning. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of Demeter's footsteps as she moved through the world she'd once made bloom. The gods on Olympus weren't used to feeling powerless. They were used to making decisions, giving orders, and having the world bend to their will. But Demeter's grief was different. It was stubborn, immovable, and it had consequences. The famine spread, and the prayers of mortals grew louder, more desperate. But Demeter didn't answer. She kept searching, kept moving, her torch burning lower and lower. Zeus, for all his power, was left with a problem he couldn't solve with thunderbolts or decrees. He'd made his choice, and now he had to live with the fallout. The balance of the world had shifted, and it wasn't clear how or when it would be restored. The other gods tried to intervene, but nothing worked. Demeter's silence was absolute. Back in the meadow, the frost deepened, the ground hardening under the weight of what had happened. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the spell. The humans below Olympus grew weaker, their hope fading with each passing day. The gods above grew restless, their arguments echoing through empty halls. But Demeter kept moving, her grief and anger shaping the world in ways no one had expected. You'd think that, after all this, something would finally give. And you'd be right. The world can't stay frozen forever, no matter how deep the pain. Somewhere high above the barren fields and silent forests, a new movement began, a ripple in the stilled air. The gods, pressed by mortal prayers and their own growing fear, started to look for a solution. They needed someone who could move between worlds, someone who could negotiate where others couldn't. And that's when you would notice a flicker in the sky, a flash of winged sandals skimming the air, moving faster than thought. The world below might have felt empty, but above, things were shifting. The next step was about to begin, and you could almost sense the change coming, quiet at first but unstoppable, like the return of light after a long cold night. Hermes arrived at the edge of the underworld with a task that felt heavier than any message he'd ever carried. This wasn't the usual errand, no clever trick, no light banter. The world above was starving, the gods were restless, and the only way forward was through a bargain. That's what brought him here, the matter of Persephone, the seeds, and the cost of letting spring return. The underworld didn't welcome visitors. Hermes moved through its halls quickly, not lingering over the polished black stone or the eerie stillness. You could sense the weight of the place, but there was no need to dwell on it. The real focus was Persephone, and the pomegranate. Nothing else mattered. Hades sat on his throne, not as a blustering tyrant, but as someone who had made a decision and was waiting to see how the world would answer it. Persephone was beside him, quiet but not broken, her hands resting in her lap. In one palm she held a pomegranate, its skin split to reveal seeds that caught the sparse light. Hermes didn't waste time. "Zeus sends me about Persephone," he said, his words echoing just enough to remind you that even the gods hesitate before the rules of old. Hades didn't flinch. He watched Hermes, but his attention kept drifting to Persephone and the fruit. The tension in the room wasn't loud, but it was there, a sense that everything depended on what happened next. The pomegranate was the center of it all. If you've ever seen one, you know it doesn't belong in a place like this. The seeds are too red, too alive. They stand out against darkness, impossible to ignore. Persephone's fingers brushed over them, almost absent-minded. The act felt loaded with meaning, and everyone in the room knew it. In myth, the pomegranate is never just a fruit. It's a symbol, a marker of marriage, of the underworld, of the line between life and death. Here it was also a trap. Hades finally spoke. "She has eaten." 3 words, no drama, but they changed everything. In the old stories, it said that Hades gave Persephone the seeds, and she ate them. Some versions say he forced her, others that she took them herself. The Homeric hymn is clear that it was against her will, but later poets leave room for other readings. The truth is, it doesn't matter much in this moment. What matters is that the act is done. The seeds are inside her now, and the law of the gods says she must return. Hermes paused, the weight of it all settling in. The rule is simple. Eat the food of the underworld, and you are tied to it. No clever arguments, no loopholes. The gods love their rules almost as much as they love their power. The pomegranate had done what all the force in the world couldn't. It had bound Persephone to Hades and his realm. You might wonder why Persephone ate the seeds at all. Was it hunger, resignation, a quiet act of rebellion or acceptance? The myths don't always agree, and neither do the storytellers. Some say Hades tricked her, others that she chose to eat, knowing what it meant. It's possible both are true. The seeds are complicated just like the gods themselves. What's clear is that Persephone's fate was sealed not with chains, but with something much smaller and more permanent, a handful of seeds. Hades didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His victory was quiet, almost mournful. He had what he wanted. A queen for his realm. Someone to bring light into the shadows. If you look at Hades in this moment, you don't see a monster. You see someone who understands what it means to want and to hold on to what you've claimed, even if the method is questionable. He watched Persephone not with triumph, but with a kind of respect. There's a reason he asked Zeus for her hand, a reason he waited so long for a companion. The underworld is vast, and even gods get lonely. The pomegranate itself is more than a symbol. It's a promise and a curse. Ancient Greeks saw it as a fruit of the dead, but also of life. Its seeds bursting with potential, its skin hiding something sweet and dangerous. Eating it meant Persephone could never fully leave the underworld. She was now part of both worlds, her story forever split between light and dark. Hermes listened as Hades explained the terms. "She has eaten 6 seeds," Hades said, his voice even. "The number matters. Some myths say she ate 4, others 8, but 6 is the most common. 6 seeds, 6 months. For half the year, Persephone would stay below, ruling as queen. For the other half, she would return to her mother, and the world would bloom again." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one that would satisfy both the gods and the laws that bound them. There was no debate. Hermes knew there was nothing to argue. He turned to Persephone, searching her face for a sign, regret, anger, relief. She met his gaze, steady and calm. If she mourned her old life, she didn't show it. If she feared what was coming, she kept it hidden. What you saw in her was something new, a quiet strength, the kind that comes from surviving what should have broken you. The bargain was struck. Persephone would return to Demeter, but only for part of the year. When she left, the world would mourn with her mother, the earth growing cold and barren. When she returned, the fields would wake, the flowers would bloom, and life would begin again. This was how the Greeks explained the seasons. Persephone's absence was winter, her return was spring. As Persephone stood, you could see the change in her. She wasn't the same girl who had wandered the meadows, picking flowers and laughing in the sunlight. She was still young, but there was something older in her now. A knowledge, a gravity. The underworld had marked her, not just with the seeds, but with experience. She knew what it was to be taken, to be forced to adapt, to find a place in a world she never chose. She also knew what it was to hold power, to be queen in a land of shadows. Hades watched her go, his face unreadable. He didn't try to stop her, but he didn't look away either. There was no triumph, no bitterness, just an understanding that this was the way things had to be. The pomegranate had done its work, and the world above would feel its effects for as long as stories were told. Hermes led Persephone out of the hall, his steps brisk but not rushed. The underworld seemed to recede behind them, the shadows falling away as they moved toward the surface. Persephone didn't look back. She carried the memory of the seeds with her, the taste lingering, the knowledge that she would always belong to 2 places at once. The fruit had bound her, but it had also made her something more than she was before. If you're picturing Persephone as a victim, try again. She was changed, yes, but not broken. The seeds weren't just a trap, they were also a key. They gave her a role no one else could fill, a reason for the world to turn as it did. She would walk in sunlight and shadow, her story written in the cycles of growth and decay. The Greeks saw this as the truth behind the seasons, the world's first winter and spring, born from a mother's grief and a daughter's return. You might wonder how Demeter would react, or what it would feel like to see the world wake up after so much silence. Hold on to that thought. Persephone's journey wasn't over. The seeds had set the terms, but the story was about to shift again. The world above was waiting, the earth holding its breath. Persephone stepped onto the path leading back to the surface, the weight of the underworld in every step, but also something lighter, an anticipation, maybe even hope. The bargain had been struck, and nothing would ever be the same. The land, the gods, and the mortals all waited for what came next, ready to see what happened when winter finally gave way to spring. Persephone's return to the world above didn't come with fanfare. It was quiet, almost hesitant, like someone stepping outside after a long illness, unsure if the air will sting or soothe. She moved slowly, the weight of months spent in shadow still clinging to her shoulders, but with every step, the ground beneath her softened. The cold that had seeped into everything retreated, not in a rush, but with the steady certainty of something that's finally allowed to let go. You probably wouldn't notice it at first. It started with a single green shoot, poking through the cracked earth. Just one, but enough to make a difference. Then another and another, not a riot of color all at once, but a measured return. The world didn't explode into life, it eased back in, cautious, like it was testing how much hope it could handle after so much stillness. The first wildflowers to open were violets, their purple petals trembling in the weak sunlight. The grass grew in patches, the frost giving up its grip inch by inch. It was the kind of change you feel more than you see, like a room warming up after someone opens the curtains. I felt it in the ground before I saw it. The frost that had wrapped itself around every root and stone started to break apart, the cold seeping away. The soil loosened, soaking up the first hints of warmth, and the roots, my own roots if you want to call them that, reached deeper, drinking in the change. The air, once sharp and brittle, grew softer. Even the wind changed, carrying the faintest scent of new growth instead of the bite of winter. Persephone didn't rush. Her hair caught the light, but she didn't smile. You could see the difference in her. She wasn't the laughing girl who once danced through these meadows. She moved with a kind of carefulness, as if she knew how easy it would be to lose all of this again. Her eyes lingered on every flower, every blade of grass, like she was memorizing them for the next time she'd have to leave. She carried the underworld with her now, not as a weight, but as a part of who she was. Demeter waited for her at the edge of the meadow. She looked nothing like the goddess of golden harvest you'd expect. Her robes were still dark, her face drawn, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there for months. She stood perfectly still, almost afraid to believe what she was seeing. Then, as Persephone came closer, Demeter broke. She ran, not gracefully, not like a goddess, but like a mother who's been waiting too long. She stumbled through the muddy earth, arms outstretched, and when she finally reached Persephone, she pulled her in so tightly it looked like she'd never let go. That moment wasn't clean or poetic. It was messy, desperate, and real. Persephone gasped, caught in her mother's grip, and for a few seconds it was just the two of them, holding on like the world might disappear if they let go. But even in that embrace, you could see it, the understanding that this reunion was temporary. Persephone's time above was limited. The taste of pomegranate still lingered, the seeds inside her a quiet reminder that she belonged to two worlds now. The land responded to their reunion. The frost melted faster, water running in clear streams through the cracks that winter had left behind. The first real flowers of spring, crocuses and irises, pushed through the softening earth, their colors sharp against the gray. Farmers saw green where there had been only brown. They knelt in the fields, hands pressed to the dirt, whispering thanks they'd almost forgotten how to give. You could hear the relief in their voices, see it in the way they moved, slow at first, then with a kind of cautious energy, as if they were afraid to hope too much. But even as life returned, there was no pretending that things would go back to how they were before. The cycle was set now. 6 months with her mother, 6 months below. Persephone would always be part of the underworld, and the world above would have to let her go again and again. That knowledge sat heavy in the meadow, in the way the flowers opened, just a little slower, the way the birds sang but paused between notes, waiting for something to change again. Mortals didn't fully understand it at first. They saw the seasons shift, the cold give way to warmth, and they built rituals around it. In Eleusis, the story of Persephone's return became the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries, those secret rites that promised something more, a hope for renewal, a belief that life could return even after the darkest winter. The reunion of mother and daughter wasn't just a myth about spring. It was a promise, woven into the very fabric of their faith, that death wasn't the end, and that joy could follow sorrow. Those mysteries were secret, their details lost to time, but everyone knew what they meant. The cycle of Persephone's descent and return was a mirror for the cycle of life and death, planting and harvest, loss and reunion. The fields that turned green again each spring were proof that the world could heal, but also a reminder that nothing lasted forever. Every year, the story played out again. Persephone leaving, the world growing cold, Demeter grieving, and then, at last, a cautious return. If you were standing in the meadow, you'd notice how the change didn't erase what had happened. The earth was softer, but it still held the memory of frost. The flowers bloomed, but their stems were thinner, the petals a little more fragile. Even the sunlight felt changed, brighter maybe, but also sharper, as if it knew it was only on loan. Persephone moved through it all, her presence both a blessing and a warning. She brought life, but she also carried the shadow of where she'd been. Demeter tried to make the most of the time they had. She walked with Persephone through the fields, showing her the new growth, the first shoots of wheat, the orchards coming back to life. The people of the villages left offerings at the temples, hoping to keep the goddess's favor a little longer. For a while, things felt almost normal. The markets filled with food again, children played in the grass, and the old songs returned. But underneath it all, everyone knew the cycle would start again. The world would turn, Persephone would leave, and winter would come back. The meadow, for its part, didn't mind the repetition. It had learned how to wait. The roots grew deeper, storing up strength for the next cold season. The streams ran clear, carving new paths through the earth. The birds built their nests higher just in case. everything and everyone adjusted, finding a way to live with the rhythm of loss and return. Persephone herself seemed to settle into her new role. She wasn't just a daughter anymore or a queen of shadows. She was both and something in between. When she laughed, it was quieter, but it carried further. When she walked, the grass seemed to lean toward her, as if remembering the sound of her footsteps. She visited the places she loved as a girl, but she also spent time in the quieter corners, where the light didn't reach as easily. She understood the value of what she'd been given and what she'd lost. The story of her return became more than just a way to explain spring. It was a lesson passed down from one generation to the next. The Eleusinian mysteries took that lesson and turned it into hope. They promised that, just as Persephone came back each year, so could anyone, at least in spirit. The fields would grow again, the flowers would bloom, and even after the longest winter, there would be a reason to look for green shoots pushing through the dirt. If you're picturing the meadow now, you'd see it full of life, but also marked by what it had survived. The petals were bright, but the stems bore scars from the frost. The wind carried the scent of new growth, but also the memory of stillness. The world had learned to live with both, and so had Persephone. As Persephone and Demeter walked together, their path winding through the fields, you could sense that nothing was truly lost. The cycle would continue, the seasons pressing against one another, each one shaped by what came before. The world had changed, and so had the gods, and so had the people who watched for the first signs of spring each year. It's easy to think of this as just a story about flowers and frost, about a mother's love and a daughter's journey. But the truth is, it's a story about balance, about what happens when joy and sorrow, life and death are woven together so tightly you can't pull them apart. The meadow understood that, so did Persephone, and maybe, if you pay attention, you'll see it in the world around you too. This cycle, loss, return, renewal, was never meant to be simple. It was always going to be complicated, marked by longing and relief, by grief and celebration. That's what gives it meaning. That's what makes the green shoot so precious. The return of warmth so welcome. It's not about erasing what happened, but about living with it. Finding a way to move forward even when you know the frost will come again. So yes, the first spring after Persephone's return was beautiful, but it was also fragile. The world didn't forget the winter. It carried the memory with it, tucked away in every root and petal. And that's what made the return matter. Not just for the gods, or for the mortals who depended on them, but for anyone who's ever lost something and found it again, even if only for a little while. There's something ancient in the way these seasons turn. A rhythm that asks you to pay attention, to notice not just the blossoms, but the spaces where nothing grows. It's in those spaces that you find the real story, the one that keeps going year after year, shaping everything it touches. What you start to notice, if you pay attention, is that there's a kind of wisdom tucked inside this cycle, a lesson so old it almost disappears into the background noise of everyday life. The myth of Persephone and Demeter isn't just about gods or the afterlife. It's about the way the world works and why it works that way. Ancient farmers saw it in their fields every year. They planted when the earth softened and warmed, watched for the first green shoots and waited out the cold, trusting that Persephone's return would bring the harvest. If you've ever wondered why people told this story for centuries, it's because it explained what they lived through, the ground going quiet, the seeds waiting, the slow return of life. The myth made sense of the planting and harvesting cycles, giving shape to the uncertainty and hope that came with each season. That's the wisdom of the eternal dance, this rhythm that ties every living thing to the land and to each other. You can see it up close if you're willing to look. When Persephone rises, the world stirs, the ground gets softer, the first shoots break through and the air shifts, crops push up and people breathe a little easier. There's a collective exhale, a feeling that the worst is over for now, but everyone knows it won't last. The same fields that burst with wheat and barley in summer will stand empty and brown come winter. The roots will pull back. The world will go quiet again. And then, just as you start to forget what color looked like, it all comes back. There's no getting around it. This cycle isn't always gentle. It can feel harsh, even unfair. Demeter's grief is the grief of anyone who's ever lost something and had to keep going anyway. When Persephone goes below, the cold comes in. The earth tightens up. Farmers look out at empty fields and wonder if anything will grow again. But here's the thing. There's always something happening beneath the surface. Even in winter, the seeds are there, waiting. The ground holds promise, even when it looks barren. That's what the Greeks understood. They built their lives around that hope, trusting that the world knew what it was doing, even when it seemed silent. If you've ever watched a field go from nothing to green in a few weeks, you know what I mean. It's not magic, but it feels like it. The soil wakes up, the air changes, people start to move differently. There's a kind of relief in the return of life, but it's never total. There's always the knowledge that it will go away again. That's the lesson Persephone teaches without ever saying a word. Nothing lasts, but nothing is lost for good either. The world is always in motion, even when it looks still. And for the ancient Greeks, this wasn't just a story to tell kids at bedtime. It was how they explained the world's unpredictability and their own place in it. Persephone's descent marked the beginning of winter, the time when the fields emptied and the work slowed. Her return meant planting, growth, and the hope of a good harvest. Farmers didn't just hope for spring, they counted on it, prayed for it, and shaped their entire lives around its return. The myth gave them a way to accept the things they couldn't change. It told them that loss and return were both part of the plan. You might think that makes the story sad, but it's not. There's comfort in knowing the pattern, even if you can't control it. Demeter's sorrow is deep, but it's not endless. She mourns, but she also rejoices. She lets go, but she welcomes Persephone back every year. That's the wisdom at the heart of this dance. You have to let things go so you can welcome them again. The fields don't fight the frost. They wait it out. The seeds don't resist the cold. They rest, and then they grow. It's not about pretending everything is fine. It's about seeing the value in every part of the cycle, not just the easy or beautiful parts. The Greeks looked at their land and saw that every season mattered. The quiet of winter was as important as the rush of spring. The harvest was sweeter because it followed months of waiting. Persephone didn't lose herself in the underworld. She changed, and so did the world she left behind. When she returned, she brought something new with her, a sense that life could start over even after the darkest months. If you're listening to this story on a night when the air is cold and the ground feels hard, remember that you're part of the same cycle. You don't have to be a farmer to feel it. Maybe you've had times when everything felt stuck, when nothing seemed to move or grow. Maybe you've watched someone you love drift out of reach, or you've let go of something you thought you'd always have. The myth of Persephone doesn't promise that things will stay the same. It promises that change is part of living, and that return is always possible, even if it looks different than before. This isn't just about explaining why the world goes cold. It's about making peace with the fact that life is always shifting. The Greeks saw that in their fields, but you can see it in your own life if you look. The wisdom of the eternal dance is that you don't have to hold on so tightly. The thing you love might leave, but they might also come back. And when they do, you'll see them with new eyes. Watching the seasons turn, year after year, you start to understand why this myth stuck around for so long. It's not just about gods or harvest. It's about the comfort of knowing there's a pattern, even when you can't see it yet. The fields go brown, but they don't stay that way. The frost comes, but it doesn't last forever. Persephone descends, but she rises again. There's a rhythm to it all, a kind of reassurance that even the hardest seasons will give way to something softer. The ancient Greeks built their faith around this idea. They celebrated Persephone's return with rituals and offerings, trusting that honoring the cycle would help keep it turning. The Eleusinian mysteries, those secret rites in Demeter's honor, promised hope and renewal to anyone willing to trust the pattern. People came from all over Greece to take part, to witness the story played out again and again, and to remind themselves that spring always follows winter. The myth wasn't just about the gods. It was about the people who lived by the land, who needed to believe that loss was never the end. If you stand in a field at the end of winter, you can feel the tension in the ground, a kind of waiting, almost like the earth is holding its breath. That's the pause before the return. It's easy to get impatient, to want the green to come back right away. But the wisdom here is in the waiting. The world knows what it's doing. The seeds know when to wake up. Persephone knows when to rise. Your job is to trust the cycle, to let yourself rest when it's time, and to welcome change when it comes. There's a quiet comfort in this predictability. It doesn't erase the hard parts, but it makes them easier to bear. When you know that spring will always follow winter, you can face the cold with a little more patience. When you know that loss is part of the dance, you can let go without fear. The myth of Persephone isn't a promise that you will never feel sorrow. It's a reminder that joy is waiting on the other side, and that the world will always find a way to begin again. So when you watch the first shoots break through the soil, or when you see the fields filled with green after months of grey, think of Persephone, think of Demeter. Remember that every return is made sweeter by what came before. The wisdom here isn't complicated, it's just this. Things change, and that's what keeps life moving. You don't have to fight it, you just have to notice it, and let yourself get comfortable with the rhythm. Let yourself rest in the quiet of winter, knowing the world is working beneath the surface. Let yourself hope for the return, even when it feels far away. And when the world begins again, let yourself celebrate, knowing you're part of something ancient and enduring. The myth of Persephone and
fields, the frozen ground, the slow return of green, they're not just signs of change. They're reminders that everything is connected, that every loss